this is, Piers? This right here, can you guys see that on the camera? That's me playing the world's smallest violin for all these crying Democrats.
I think having Tulsi as DNI and Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General and Bobby Kennedy at the Health Department, these are the best picks that Trump's made.
If I was a Palestinian right now, my heart would have sunk by some of these appointments.
We are witnessing the full weight of religious fanaticism combining with U.S. military power right now to allow Israel to obliterate Palestinians, and it's going to be a real question of what happens next.
Jillian, your view, Trump, the new Washington?
No. I'm going to say no.
I've said before, she's at best a Putin cheerleader. At worst, she's a Putin asset.
She literally fought for America.
We are going to keep having Republican presidents because of people like you still talking Russia shit, Joe. Get over it. It's over.
The most powerful people in US politics were guests of honor at the USC this weekend and were greeted as conquering champions themselves. That sentence alone would have sounded implausible, if not bizarre, even a few short years ago. But President Trump is now the disruptor-in-chief. And judging by the reaction of the crowd in New York on Saturday, a lot of people are here for it.
Trump. I wish the people at home could hear the sound in this room.
It's so loud in here.
It is so loud. It's always loud when he comes here, but now that he's won, now that he's the president again, oh my God.
So Donald Trump.
It wasn't just the setting that made this an iconic symbol of the revolution now underway in US politics. Trump made a beeline for Joe Rogan, a former Bernie Sanders supporter whose interview and endorsement were pivotal in the campaign. The president-elect was flanked by Elon Musk, RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. All of those people, including Trump himself, used to be Democrats. All of them will play a major role in the new Republican government. But with every revolution, there's a resistance. And outside of the arena, Trump's cabinet picks have unleashed panic and, well, frankly, devastation.
If you live in a rural area and there's not a hospital very close to you, but there is a community center closer to you, it could be decimated under Robert F. Kennedy. We're talking about the potential decimation of community health centers.
And we haven't even gotten to Tulsi Gabbard potentially having access to national security information. And Russia loves it, loves her.
And I actually think almost more than Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard's appointment is devastating.
It could be worse. You could have AOC running any of those departments. The president's nominations for top jobs have been roundly condemned by some as crazy. An MSNBC pundit made the outrageous claim that Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick for defense, is a white supremacist. He's not. Tulsi Gabbard, the incoming head of national intelligence, has faced a fresh barrage of familiar accusations she's a Russian agent. She's not. RFK Jr. is being hauled over the coals for just about everything, including eating a Big Mac, which, to be fair, he didn't look overly thrilled about. We'll debate the pros and cons of Trump's cabinet picks in a moment, but it's worth making one simple point. Trump is doing exactly what he said he'd do if he got elected. And he just won the presidency in an emphatic, clean sweep. If that's not a mandate for him to now do what he said he'd do, then what is? To debate this, I'm joined by Richard Painter, the former chief White House ethics lawyer under George W. Bush, Dave Smith, the host of Part of the Problem, commentator on the PBD podcast, Vincent Oshana, and Jillian Michaels, the health expert and host of Keeping It Real. Well, welcome to all of you, a stellar panel. Vinny, let me start with you, because you're probably likely to be the most jubilant member of the panel today. Your thoughts on Trump's cabinet picks so far?
First of all, thank you, Piers, for having me on. Again, it's an honor. And what's up, everybody in the panel? I think they're actually fantastic, Piers. And actually, I brought notes today. So first of all, Piers, Rubio's going to take Tony Blinken's spot, right? Tony Blinken's history. Left 13 dead service members in Afghanistan. Allies abandoned. Weak on China. And I don't know if you guys paid attention. He wants to rush $8 billion to Ukraine before January 20th. And last night, Vladimir Putin was threatening nuclear war. And by the way, you know where Joe Biden is? In the Amazon dressed like Crocodile Dundee, Piers. It's absolutely ridiculous. I think they're all Pete Hegseth. They're calling him a white supremacist. And it's like, you know what, I realized something, Piers? The left just will not understand. They've been to the Super Bowl twice. They've lost twice. They're using the same plays. And it's not working. Change your offensive BS rhetoric. Your offensive coordinator's horrible. Tulsi Gabbard is a freaking veteran. Pete Hegseth, veteran. He has a tattoo on his chest. They're like, he's a Nazi. It's a Christian cross. And anything, one of the best ones, getting Alejandro Mayorkas, who is one of the worst criminals in this country, what he does, what he's done with the border, what he's done with FEMA, Piers, I am so excited. And you know what this is, Piers? This right here, can you guys see that on the camera? That's me playing the world's smallest violin for all these crying Democrats. I can't wait for this administration to get stuff going. I'm excited.
I think Jillian might be agreeing with you there. I'm not sure the other two will. Let me go to Richard Painter. Richard, there's clearly a divide in the Republican Party. There are the pro-Trump element of the party who are gung-ho for this and think this is exactly the kind of disruption that they were hoping he would do if he won again. And my goodness, he's doing it. But there are also more what I would call perhaps traditional Republicans, and I would park you in that camp, who are not as happy about all this and think this goes against what he should be doing as a Republican president. So tell me your view of why you're concerned about these picks.
Well, I'm a political independent now, so I can criticize both parties, and I'm happy to go into details to how I think the Democrats screwed the pooch of this election, is something that they seem to be quite good at. But bottom line is that Donald Trump, he is the president-elect, but he's the president-elect under our Constitution and the laws of the United States, and the laws must be complied with. He has every right to nominate his cabinet for confirmation by the Senate. That is the way this is going to work. He does not have the right to try to force the Senate into recess so he can make recess appointments. The recess is going to be before he takes office. So these nominees need to go through the Senate confirmation process. Now, he has 53, I believe, seats in the Senate with the Republicans. So he just simply needs to convince the Senate these are good nominees. Now, Matt Gaetz, for the Attorney General spot, has an ethics investigation going on in the House. And I don't know what's in that report, and I'm not going to speculate about what's in that report, but it absolutely must be turned over to the United States Senate for confirmation. I went through this in the Bush administration. Every nominee we sent up, they wanted a full background report on. And it was the Republican senators who were harder on us than the Democrats, because the Republicans knew that if they voted yes on somebody who had a background problem, they would have to confront the voters. Whereas the Democrats may just vote no on all of Donald Trump's nominees. They don't have to worry about it. The Republicans do. So there's going to be a Senate confirmation process. Second, everyone must comply with the financial conflict of interest rules. And that means selling off your assets that conflict with your official duties. We have a criminal conflict of interest statute, 18 United States Code 208, and you may not participate in a government matter that impacts your financial holdings. So Elon Musk, he may be outside the government, and there's a way to work that under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, where he can be outside the government and advise the government. But they're going to have to do this according to the law. And that's all I'm going to insist on. I'm not going to weigh in on the policy preferences and so forth. The voters have had their say, whether the voters voted for Donald Trump's policies or whether the voters were fed up with the way the Democrats handled things, with Joe Biden hanging on to this thing all the way through July and then swapping out candidates. I think Kamala Harris was a perfectly good candidate, but they only gave her about 100 days to run. When the Democrats should have realized that Joe Biden was a one-term president years ago. So they flubbed it, and Donald Trump's our president. I just want to be the president in accordance with the Constitution and the laws of the United States.
Okay, Dave Smith, I want to play a little mashup of the reaction to Matt Gaetz, in particular, being nominated to be Attorney General. Let's take a look.
You're getting Matt Gaetz, and they hate Matt Gaetz.
Yes.
They hate Matt Gaetz more than they hate anybody. These establishment Republicans.
He's never going to get confirmed. I'm looking at him as a member of Congress and the job that he has done here, and it has been abhorrent.
When I heard that Matt Gaetz was picked to be Attorney General, I threw up in my mouth.
It must be the worst nomination for a cabinet position in American history.
Why not? I mean, if Matt Gaetz is going to be Attorney General, bring in Gary Busey to run the CIA. Go for broke.
Clearly, it's just kind of like a God tier kind of trolling, just to trigger a meltdown.
Dave, your response to the picks generally, but particularly Matt Gaetz.
Well, I mean, I think that essentially the picks who the corporate media are freaking out about are the best picks that Trump's made. Personally, I'm not too happy with a lot of his foreign policy picks. But I think having Tulsi as DNI and Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General and Bobby Kennedy at the Health Department, these are the best picks that Trump's made. And of course, in the upside down world that we live in, the corporate media, the professional lying class, the people who told you that Joe Biden was sharp as a tack and Kamala Harris was joy and a phenomenon, and Tony Hinchcliffe was a speaker at an event making a comment, and there was a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden, and the list goes on and on and on and on. That's just in the last few months. Yeah, of course, they're all freaking out about this. I think what's really going on here is that Donald Trump has quite craftily put a person in charge of national intelligence and a person in charge of the Justice Department, assuming they get confirmed, who were outside of the Russiagate hoax. And this is what's making everybody freak out right now. You know, so many things happen in modern America. There's so many big stories that we kind of forget that a few years ago, there was this little tiny story where the intelligence agencies framed the sitting president for treason for years and had their corporate media outlets say that the sitting president, the biggest scandal, if true, in the history of the United States of America, that sitting president was involved with a hostile foreign power in a conspiracy to overthrow our elections. They knew this was not true. They lied. And now their bosses are not only people who were outside of this conspiracy, but in Tulsi Gabbard's example, someone who was also smeared with that same accusation. As you saw, Joy Reid, as you played, just did the same thing again. And I'll say, I'm sorry, I don't want to go too long here. I'll just say this. It is the most vicious, dishonest, despicable smear to use this innuendo where you say, you know, Putin, Russia's thrilled that Tulsi Gabbard's in there. And it kind of leaves the viewer with this like implicit accusation that this woman who served her country is a traitor to her country, when that means nothing. Look, in 2002, if you opposed the war in Iraq, Saddam Hussein probably would have been happy to see you in there. But that doesn't mean you're a traitor to your country. That just meant that in 2002, you were right while the entire establishment was wrong.
Listen, I totally agree with you. We're going to come to the foreign policy part a little later. And I know you've got differing views there about some of the picks, but interesting to see what you said about those three. Let me go to Jillian, because specifically, you're a fitness guru, obviously, and radiating good health today, may I say so. But this whole issue of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., it's interesting. Before I interviewed him, and I've interviewed him maybe 5-6 times now, I had a kind of view of him that I'd seen from the media, that he was a complete crackpot, that he was anti all vaccines and so on and so on. And that certainly wasn't the impression I got. And actually, the more I interviewed RFK Jr., the more impressive I felt he was. He's obviously fiercely intelligent. He's extremely well-read. And it seems to me he comes at this essentially from a good place. He wants more transparency, and he wants to make America a healthier place. Now, am I living in cloud cuckoo land, Jillian, or is that pretty much the reality?
That's exactly the reality. Is he eccentric? Yes, he's a little bit eccentric, but he's a good person. If you look at his history, this is a guy who sued Monsanto, DuPont, General Electric. He's an environmental attorney. His goal was to clean up chemicals out of our environment to help people not get cancer. Now, if you look at what he's promised to do, it's 3 things. So the first one, obviously, is he wants to end corruption. If you look at the revolving door between our government agencies and industry, it's terrifying. I could give you a million different examples of how scary this is, but let's go to one that everybody knows, which is OxyContin. The guy at the FDA who approved OxyContin went and took a cushy job for Purdue. There are a million examples like this. He wants gold standard research when it comes to vaccines and drugs, but particularly vaccines, because the research on those is not up to par. And I'm going to give you a perfect example. He wants human randomized control trials. So if you look at hepatitis B, which is one of the most controversial vaccines for kids because it's specifically for people who have risky sex and use needles. And you can test the mother to find out if she's negative before you vaccinate the newborn. So why does a child even need this? Well, ironically, after the drug companies were given blanket immunity in 1986, they added 48 more doses of vaccinations to the schedule. But let's look at Hep B. What are the clinical trials that it goes through? I think your mind is going to be blown, and I encourage everybody to look this up. It's on the FDA's website. They tested 147 kids in 3 trials, and they monitored them for 5 days. Does that seem up to par? I don't think so. And then the second thing, and by the way, I could give you a million other examples just like this one. And the third thing is he was tasked with dramatically improving the health of Americans. And in case everybody's missed it, we are unhealthier than ever. 74% of adults are overweight or obese. We've all heard the diatribe. I'll run through it one more time. We're more infertile than ever. Infertility rates are going up 1% every year. Autism, 1 in 34 kids. It was like 1 in 10,000. When I was a child, I mean, we could go on and on and on. Does rock bottom have a basement? I don't think so. There's a loophole in the FDA that lets 10,000 chemicals into our food, 9,000 of which are banned in every other country of the developing world. I mean, my God, really? I think what you're seeing here is the absolute panic of big food, big farming, big pharma, and big insurance, and for good reason. Because it's absolutely corrupt. And I, for one, am so excited about this, and I will do everything to help get this guy confirmed.
Richard Painter, you were the White House ethics lawyer. This battle, really, between big industry, big pharma, the big military complex, whatever it may be, and government, do you feel instinctively, you're now an independent, as you said, do you feel instinctively that it's long overdue time, perhaps, for some disruptive people to get in there and break the cycle?
Well, we just need to have government officials who don't have conflicts of interest, who are not kowtowing to industry. But fact of the matter is that both political candidates took an enormous amount of money from large corporations. And it remains to be seen what President Trump will actually do. There's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk. Let's see what actually happens, because in his first term, he was not taking on big industry, whether it's the big defense contractors who run our defense budget up sky high to almost $900 billion, the big food companies we just talked about, oil, fossil fuel companies and the like. None of them were taken on. President Biden didn't do that much better a job of taking on the corporate interests. So let's see what actually happens, because there's a lot of talk before the election, and then you get the job, and then you have to actually do it. Now, I do hope that instead of talking on and on about Russia and 2016 and so forth, and the 2020 election and all of that, that the president-elect, when he becomes president, can focus on policy and implementing his policy as best he can in cooperation with a Republican majority in the House and Senate. If this is just going to be a time when people just want to talk about Russiagate or talk about the indictments and January 6th and pardon the January 6ers and so forth, it's just going to be a real mess. He was elected to do a job. He has a majority in both houses. They can do it, but they also need to comply with the Constitution and the laws of the United States. And a lot of reason why these corporations have so much influence in Republican and Democratic administrations is people are not taking the ethics laws seriously. And it's about time they do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Vinny, would you disagree with that? I mean, is it not time that America took a good, long, hard look at itself in the mirror? The power of lobby groups, the power of big pharma, the power of the military complex, and so on. I mean, it does seem that there are so many obvious conflicts here, which have been allowed to run riot for decades.
And no, I agree 100%, Piers. You know what I think it is? I think the left has Stockholm syndrome, Piers. They have fallen in love with their abuser, and now they're defending the abuser. And Jillian made a great point about RFK. I mean, who's in there right now, Piers? Xavier Becerra. He's a lawyer. Everybody's like, RFK has no experience. This guy's a lawyer, and she nailed it. Look at the mental health crisis we have going on. Everybody's obese. Everybody is depressed. Okay, and then who's the assistant? Who's the admiral, the assistant? Rachel Levine, who is a biological male. These people are in charge of our health. A biological male dressed as a woman who has been pushing to eliminate age restriction for transgender surgeries for children. I think, Piers, let them cry all they want. They're going to keep crying. This is the change. This is the moment that we need. And I'm happy you played the UFC thing in the beginning. Everybody's dancing like Trump. The vibe is positive. All these football players are dancing and being like him. And this is, Piers, you have to understand, he's coming in and RFK's going to mess with Big Pharma. That's $1 trillion. Like, these people don't play games, all right? And this guy's lost his father and his uncle, Piers. And a lot of people would say, especially with these JFK files, that the government and the CIA were involved. You go after anybody that's going against war, you wind up dead. RFK needs to be careful because remember how long they denied Secret Service from this guy? They had to finally because Trump was shot in the head. He's messing with Big Pharma, but I think it's amazing, Piers, and he's the best guy to do the job, plain and simple.
Dave, the presence of Elon Musk is sort of omnipotent right now. He's right with Trump morning, noon and night, whether he's at Mar-a-Lago, whether he's at Madison Square Garden, whatever. I've met Musk once this summer. He's got a stupendous brain. I mean, I had a couple of hours with him, one with a Q&A and then one just with me, him and a couple of others. He's got an incredible brain. There's no question. And I would absolutely back him to sort out extravagant waste in government bureaucracy, as him and Vivek Ramaswamy are doing. But is it right that somebody who is Elon Musk, with all the power that he has in so many different industries, is it right that he now has an unelected super hold over the president?
Well, I mean, it's not as if voters didn't know that Elon Musk was in Trump's corner when they elected him. And if anything, I actually think it was one of the things that really helped Donald Trump. I think that one of the things that was different, as we've talked about on the show before, Piers, from 2016 or even 2020, was that you had this group of like Bobby Kennedy and Elon Musk and these kind of former Democrats who were now coming around Donald Trump. And so, look, it's a real question mark what this DOGE thing is actually going to end up being. It seems so far to me that Donald Trump has given Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy full reign of an imaginary department that he just made up, and I don't really know what is going to come from that. I was speaking with Vivek the other day, and he is really bullish on it. He's like, no, we've got some great ideas about how this is actually going to work, and we're going to give great recommendations. It remains to be seen. I will say that there is this strange dynamic where, like when Elon Musk bought Twitter, even, you would see people in the corporate media freaking out about how a rich person can now control the information as if this is anything new. And as if the owner of the Washington Post is just a middle-class guy or something like that. This is the way American politics works, for better or for worse. There are certainly valid critiques of it, but the issue that people have with Elon Musk, I don't think, is that he's a rich guy who gave a lot of money to Trump's campaign and now has a position. I mean, Miriam Adelson gave Trump $100 million, and okay, she doesn't have a position, but certainly the picks that she would like have a lot of powerful positions in his administration. And this is true on the Democratic side as well. So the difference to me seems to be that Elon Musk is actually talking about cutting some of government spending. Of course, the U.S. federal government is the biggest, most powerful organization in the history of the world, the biggest government that's ever existed. And so if you dare talk about cutting some spending in that, then all of a sudden you're a pariah. If you talk about exposing corruption, then all of a sudden we have this real problem with rich people in politics. Meanwhile, nobody is saying anything. I shouldn't say nobody, but the same people who are critical of Elon Musk certainly are not talking about Miriam Adelson or Soros or anything like that. So let's be consistent here.
Richard, we're going to let you go. So just finally, on Elon Musk, do you see ethical issues with his role at the moment? It's not a government role, it's an advisory role, but it seems to have almost limitless power when it comes to reducing government spending. Is that ethical?
Well, first of all, we should understand that rich people are going to come into the administration, and that has been true of Democrats and Republicans, even though the role of money in politics has escalated dramatically in the United States. But the rich people have gotten the powerful positions, going all the way back to Joe Kennedy, who was ambassador to the United Kingdom under Franklin Roosevelt, who had contributed a lot to Roosevelt's campaign and was a complete disaster in that position when Britain was at war with Germany. But we've had that. We had that in the Biden administration. It was very critical of the ambassador of Germany and Canada, who had used money from the University of Pennsylvania to set up a center for Joe Biden, and they got ambassadorships. We're going to have this in the Trump administration. So Elon Musk, of course, spent a huge amount of money getting Trump elected. He will have a role. But we need to figure out whether he's in the administration or out, and they need to make this very, very clear. If he's in the administration and he's a government official, he needs to comply with the Financial Conflict of Interest Statute, 18 United States Code 208. He is going to have to sell off his assets that have present a conflict of interest. He would commit a crime if he participated in a government matter that had direct and predictable impact on his companies, on his government contracts, and the like. I don't think he wants to do that. So even though they call this DOGE, D-O-G-E, a department of government efficiency, a department is almost always viewed as an entity inside the government, but apparently it's going to be outside the government, they say now. So now he can be outside the government. He does not have to comply with the financial conflicts of interest rules, but they need to do this according to the Federal Advisory Committee Act of 1972. You don't just set up committees outside the government that play by their own rules and then are giving advice to the president and to government agencies. Under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, the proceedings of the DOGE need to be transparent. There need to be meetings announced in advance. The public needs to have the right to have some input. And most important, there will be no assertion of executive privilege because this is an entity outside the government. And that's the law. So they have a choice here. If they want all the confidentiality and the secrecy that comes with the White House and the executive office of the president and the executive privilege, then Elon Musk comes into the government, he complies with the financial conflict of interest rules, or he does this under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. But we don't sort of play around halfway in between, because if they do, what's going to happen is you're going to get the Democrats in there at some point, controlling the House or the Senate, probably the House at some point, and this starts subpoenaing everybody and get every last shred of evidence about what was going on, and it could be a big mess and detract from their doing their job. So once again, I get back to my point here, which is President Trump will take office again in January. He needs to conduct his administration according to the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and he can do that. It's just a question of whether he will and whether the people working with him will. I hope they do.
Richard W. Pellier, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is among President Trump's controversial picks. The incoming Director of National Intelligence spoke to Jesse Waters at Fox News.
He's already leading. He's already engaging with so many of these world leaders around the world on the phone constantly. And he's showing the kind of leadership that the American people voted for.
We're joined on the panel now as the host of The Social Contract, former Republican presidential candidate and Congressman Joe Walsh, who says that Gabbard is a Putin cheerleader. Well, Joe, welcome back to Uncensored. Do you think she's a total disaster? Why?
You can't trust her. This country cannot trust her with our intelligence. If I'm one of our allies, there's no way if she's appointed, I'm sharing my intelligence with America. Look, I've said before, she's at best a Putin cheerleader. At worst, she's a Putin asset. For the past decade, she has done nothing but defend Vladimir Putin and parrot Putin and Russian propaganda. Again, there's a list. I could take 30 minutes and go through the list. That's a humongous concern. She's not on our side. She's clearly on Russia's side.
She literally fought for America. She served her country and fought for America. How can you say she's not on our side?
She's still up here. She's still in the military. She's still in the military.
Sure.
Joe, first of all, this is the guy that says he's not you're not a Democrat. I remember this guy who was on the PPD podcast. You are exactly the problem that, listen to me, I want you to keep talking the way that you're talking because
buddy,
of people like you.
Hey,
excuse me. You know what? Let me finish. Because of people like you, and your rhetoric, you know what's going to happen? J.D. Vance is going to be the president next. Tulsi Gabbard's going to be the president. Eric Trump's going to be the president. We are going to keep having Republican presidents because of people like you still talking Russia shit, Joe. Get over it. It's over. You're talking about an active military girl. She's a lieutenant colonel in the Army, and you're saying she's an asset. You're an idiot. Yes. You're an idiot. And people are tired of your bullshit.
Okay, let him respond. Vinny,
change the record.
Let him respond, Vinny.
Do me a favor,
change
my friend.
the record, bro.
Instead of attacking me, attack what I said about Tulsi Gabbard. For a decade,
she's a
she
Russian
has
asset?
done nothing but ferret Putin. Address that. Address that.
But but Joe, I will address that.
I'll address that very
I'm going to come to. Hang on. I'm going to come to Jillian in a second. All I would say, Joe, is I get an email each week from Ian Bremner, one of the guys I most respect in the political world. He's very balanced, gives very insightful weekly emails about what's going on in the news. He said he's seen absolutely no evidence that she has ever been anything even approaching a Russian asset. It's a total myth of the Democrat side to suggest she ever has been.
Piers, you're going to ignore 10 years of what she said?
Well, she's allowed to have she's allowed to have an opinion.
Of course she is.
Well, hang on, she's allowed to have an opinion about Ukraine. She can have an opinion about Ukraine.
No, of course she
and
is.
You may not agree with that opinion. And by the way, I don't agree with her opinion about Ukraine, but she's allowed to have it. It doesn't make her a Russian asset.
No, Piers, exactly. She's allowed to have her opinion. Donald Trump has picked her to head up all our intelligence efforts in this country.
Yeah, but there is no evidence that she would be a threat to leaking that intelligence to Russia. It's a myth.
Not at all.
All right, let me go to Jillian.
She's either a dupe or an asset because everything she's done the past 10 years and said has been exactly what Russia would want her to say or do. So she's either an asset or a dupe.
That's
but
the
she's
dumbest
clearly not on our
standard
side.
ever. Who cares? If I said
side.
Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, that might be exactly what Saddam Hussein wants me to say. That doesn't mean anything. You see, Piers, this is the trick here. And I'm sorry, I know you want to go to Julian, but the trick is that the same way they used to say Trump-Russia collusion, they wouldn't say Donald Trump's in a conspiracy with the Russians. You see, because that's actually meets the criminal code. And then so you just say collusion because what does that even mean? They could have had a phone call. Okay, they're colluding, but that's totally legal. So when you say she's a Russian asset, you give this wink and a nod like she's a traitor, when what it means, and Piers, you disagree with me on this topic too, but listen, the argument is that there were 1 million off-ramps to the war in Ukraine, and that the West chose to not take any of them, and that this war could have been avoided, and it could have been negotiated away. Now, the idea that if someone makes this argument, your counter to that is to say that you're a Putin asset. This is so, first off, it's just despicable and it's profoundly stupid. It makes absolutely no sense at all. So listen, at least during the original McCarthyism period, at least during the House Committee on American Activities, at least back then, there were some communists. Nobody is loyal to Vladimir Putin. This is the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
You're entitled. No, Tulsi Gabbard, of course, is entitled to her opinion as a citizen of this country. But if for 10 years your opinion is identical to Russian propaganda, we are entitled to question that. And someone like that,
you're saying nothing, and I'm entitled to make the point that that's the dumbest argument I've ever heard in my life.
You both made your points. Let me bring it. Okay. Time out. Let's bring in Jillian. Been waiting very patiently to get back in here. I mean, Jillian, my experience of Tulsi Gabbard, I interviewed Tulsi a couple of months ago. I thought she was extraordinarily impressive, I have to say. And I think this idea that you categorize her because she happens to think that the history of the Ukraine-Russia war, that she actually has a view, which many on the Republican side do, by the way, that actually it could have been avoided. I don't believe that, but I certainly understand that view. and it's been expressed to me by professors and everybody else. I don't certainly look upon her as some kind of traitor for having that view. What do you think?
Okay, first of all, I believe that for half of those 10 years, wasn't she a celebrated Democrat, or am I forgetting or missing something? That said, let's look at what she's actually said. So this is a combat veteran that was deployed to Iraq, which was an absolute pointless war by neocons like Dick Cheney, who I personally think is a war criminal, but we could table that argument for another day. This is a woman that I imagine has seen people die in horrible ways, has seen mothers lose sons, wives lose husbands. She's for peace. Now, when you are engaging in a proxy war with a nuclear power, I would imagine that we should do everything possible to ensure that that does not happen. And in addition, she's also raising the alarm bell about biochemical weapons in Ukraine, these labs, which is exactly how we got COVID, is gain of function research. And she has said specifically that we need diplomacy, that if you look at Reagan, he spoke with Gorbachev. If you look at Kennedy, he spoke with Khrushchev to avoid disaster. That's what she has advocated for. That's why she sat with Assad and all of the people, the people that opposed him. She sat with everybody when she went to Syria. Didn't Nancy Pelosi also sit with Assad, unless I'm crazy? And not only that, if we look at, I'm with Dave.
Well,
I have done a lot of homework on this one.
Civilians, well before.
Okay, so here's my question. So you wouldn't sit down with these kinds of people and you would just let people die when, ironically, it's the military-industrial complex that's making, oh my God, isn't it almost $1 trillion off of these wars? I mean, who's profiting off of this? There were numerous off-ramps here. So what are you going to do? You want to punch Putin in the nose because he's a bully?
Okay, let me just jump in.
Someone correct me if I'm wrong.
Let me jump in. I want to ask Joe this question, because the New York Times reported yesterday a major change in US policy, allowing Ukraine to use American-supplied long-range weapons inside Russia. I think this is a good thing. I think you've got to push Putin hard, especially if you're talking about negotiating at any stage some kind of settlement. He can't be seen to do that from a position of overwhelming potential victory. He's got to be on the back foot, is my view. But Donald Trump Jr. posted to X on Sunday night, the military-industrial complex seems to want to make sure they get World War III going before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives. Got to lock in those trillions. Life be damned, imbeciles. It looks to me, I mean, we just don't know what Donald Trump's view of all this is. He's met with Zelensky several times. We know he's been talking to Putin. We know he says he can resolve this in 24 hours. We're not sure when that time period starts. But what do you make of all this? How concerned should the Ukrainians be that on the one hand, the good news, they're getting these long-range missiles, and on the other, you're getting all these signs from the Trump world that they don't want to have anything to do with this?
I'll take a first stab. I think it's a good move, but Piers, it should have been done a long time ago by Biden. It may be a little too late, but I'm glad he did it. If I'm Ukraine and I'm Zelensky, I'm extremely concerned. I mean, let's just not erase 2 years of Trump's campaign history where he's made very clear he doesn't give a damn about Ukraine. He wants to end the war. If that means he'll help cut up Ukraine and give a bunch of territory to Russia, he'll do it. He's extremely friendly.
We don't know
with Putin.
that yet.
And again,
We don't know that yet. He's not said that.
No, but we know based on what he's said that he's been critical of Zelensky and he's been nothing but praise for Putin. And again,
well, actually, the only one he's met actually recently is Zelensky, not Putin. So again, we don't know. And Zelensky seemed quite happy about the way that meeting went. So here's the thing about Trump. The one undeniable thing about him is that he is got a big ego. Nothing wrong with that. So have I. You've got a big ego, and the last thing he will want to do when he becomes president again is the first thing is to give Vladimir Putin a win. He's not going to do that. He's not going to allow Putin to have some victory parade over Ukraine. I can't believe that Trump, the first thing he wants is to say to Putin, a Russian dictator, there you go, you beat the Americans at anything, which is how it would be construed.
Pierce, respectfully disagree. And by the way, he just gave Putin a big win because he just picked a Putin propagandist to be in charge of our intelligence. That's a big win for Putin.
Okay, let me bring in Vinny.
Piers,
let me bring in Vinny. Vinny,
Piers.
your response.
But Piers, I honestly think I'm in the twilight zone when this guy talks. Like, are we forgetting that for 4 years nothing happened? Okay, nothing happened with Russia. Your Russian asset BS dialect. It's horseshit. Who's in charge right now of national intelligence? It's Avril Haines. Okay, under her, she couldn't foresee this Russia invasion in Ukraine. We're talking about everything that has already happened. I love how it's always Trump. Now it's Tulsi, it's Russia. Why didn't none of this happen 4 years ago? He literally went on camera yesterday, Putin, and said, if you guys launch anything, I'm going to use nuclear capability.
Hang on,
Enough of this BS.
Vinny, hang on. You talk about BS. He has threatened to use nuclear weapons from day one of this war. And guess what? Every time the West has actually crossed one of his so-called red lines, he's done nothing. I don't think there's any chance that Vladimir Putin is going to press a nuclear button. Because you know why? He would be vaporized along with his country in 30 nanoseconds. So if you think about it logically, this guy's not an Islamic fundamentalist. He's not going to risk his own life, right, for some great cause. He's not that way minded. He's a megalomaniac oligarch who's built $100 billion personal empire out of being a former KGB thug who now runs the country in the same way. But this idea that he's going to press a button that signals MAD, as they call it, MAD, mutually assured destruction. Why would he do that? So why do we keep allowing him to rattle his nuclear saber rather than it being what it should be, which is a deterrent against being attacked, as an offensive weapon to stop people getting involved? Why do we allow him to do that? When did Republicans like you, Vinny, I say this with great respect, you know I love you, but when did Republicans...
I love you too.
When did Republicans start to just back off Russian dictators and want them to win, which is effectively what would happen here if we let Ukraine go and don't help them?
Hold on a second.
I mean,
am I missing something?
Yeah,
because
hang on, Jillian, I'll come to you. Let's get Vinny to respond first.
Vinny? Well, Piers, and again, Jillian, I'll be very quick. And Piers, I get it. Everybody always threatens, especially when they're nuclear power.
It's your turn.
But I'm going back to my point. No, it's all good. Jillian, it's all good. So, but Piers, and I go back to my point. So he's always threatened and he's done it. I don't take any nuclear threat. I worked at a nuclear missile base, Piers, in Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana, when I was in the United States Air Force, okay? This isn't people. I know he's threatened or he hinted, but the fact that now we're sending long-range missiles to go into Russia, this is ridiculous.
Well, hang on. Vinny,
Joe Biden,
Vinny, hang on. He's just got 10,000 troops from North Korea to join Russian forces to attack Ukrainians. Sorry, where's the response to that dramatic escalation? Why is America not going, no, that's not happening on our watch, which I think is why Biden's done what he's done. It's too little, too late. But Jillian, you want to get involved, Jillian?
Well, here's how it looks to me, okay? When they disbanded the USSR, didn't we promise not to expand NATO? And then didn't we subsequently move it like 1,000 or so miles right up against the Russian border? Didn't we add like 14 countries? Wasn't that our part of the bargain, that we weren't going to do it? And then we did exactly what he said do not do. And if you look at the past, 3 decades, there's plenty of evidence that suggests we have been pushing to do that. And that is what I think Tulsi is trying to illustrate, is an understanding of what role we played.
When has NATO ever acted?
I'm not anti-American.
Hang on. When has NATO?
No? Okay, so someone
hang on, Jillian. When has NATO ever acted offensively unilaterally rather than defensively?
Oh, excuse me. Well, okay, you threw unilaterally in there. Yes. Serbia, Libya, Afghanistan.
No, I'm talking about unilaterally, where NATO has precipitated the military action and not acted in a defensive capacity. Dave?
Well, Piers, I mean, first of all, I'll just say that I didn't realize I was doing this panel with two Ukrainian assets who were going to be spreading Zelensky talking points. So I'm appalled. I'm just so appalled. Oh, you see how, oh, wait, I'm sorry.
That's a valid point.
I'm sorry. That is a brain dead non-argument. So let me not start with that. Okay. Now, look, Piers, if you're gonna make the standard, okay, yes, NATO took aggressive action in Serbia, in Libya, in Afghanistan, but it wasn't unilateral. The U.S. was involved. Like, okay, but it's not self-evident that that should be the standard. And to Jillian's point, look, it doesn't make you an asset of a foreign government to say, hey, as John Mearsheimer puts it, let's have some strategic empathy here. Let's put ourselves in the position of our enemy or the hostile foreign government.
Right.
And in 2008, I'd highly recommend anyone who wants to can go find this online. We only know about this because the heroic Julian Assange leaked it. But the current CIA director, Burns, at the time was the ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a private cable back to then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And it's titled "Niet Means Niet." And what he said in that memo to the Secretary of State was that he's talked to everyone in Russia, and it's not Vladimir Putin. It's his sharpest liberal critics. It's his sharpest right-wing critics. They are unanimous that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of red lines for them, and they will intervene to stop that. Now, you can feel however you feel about that. Maybe you could say, hey, Ukraine ought to have the right to join whatever military alliance they want. Let's be real here for a second. Does Mexico have a right to join a military alliance with China? Do you think we would put up with that? What do you think Washington, D.C. would do if the Soviet Union, let's say, still existed, and they toppled the government in Canada and put in their own pro-Soviet government?
So you would, just to be clear, Dave, you wouldn't want America to defend Taiwan, say, if they got invaded by China, by that yardstick?
Well, listen, it's not even a matter of want.
Well, yes or no?
Listen, here's the problem is this thing called reality, Piers. It's kind of like asking if Washington, D.C., let's just say our government
what's the answer to my question,
Well, but I am answering your question. Just give me one second.
Would you want America to go to Taiwan's aid if it was invaded by China?
And let me just explain what my point is here. If Washington, D.C. decided we're taking Mexico City, would you want China to stop us from doing that? The reality is China can't stop us from doing that. You see, we got this empire mentality in America where we think we can decide what goes on all around the world. Now, the point, again, back to this current conflict, 2 months after the Niet Means Niet memo was sent, at the Bucharest summit, George W. Bush strong-armed it through. We announced that Ukraine was coming into NATO. We've constantly, at every step, even when Vladimir Putin has had reasonable demands, you cannot bring my biggest neighbor into your military alliance, we have thrown the middle finger in his face.
The biggest mistake, honestly, I think the biggest mistake.
Wise.
Well, look, I think the biggest mistake we made with Ukraine was we made them give up their nuclear deterrent. If they still had their nuclear deterrent, they wouldn't have to worry about Vladimir Putin rattling his nuclear saber because they'd have their own to fire back at him, and he wouldn't have invaded. So that was a big strategic error as well. But I'm not oblivious to the history, and I don't think you can ignore it. I mean, Joe, it's complex. Like a lot of these, like Israel and Gaza and Hamas, like all these things. These are complicated historical issues.
But then why, when Tulsi brings up the history, is she a Russian asset?
I agree with you.
That's just what I want to understand.
I agree with you. But Jillian, I agree with you. But Joe, what is your response to what Dave says there, which Jillian also believes, which Tulsi also believes, that basically the West collectively goaded Putin by doing what he has specifically said, I don't want you to do?
Again, and to answer Jillian and to answer your Pierce, it's because her side is utterly one-sided. Jillian, you said all Tulsi believes in is peace. And if that's true, all she does is attack America and defend Russia when we talk about peace. Look, I understand the situation's complicated, but Russia invaded a sovereign nation. Putin's to blame for that, not America. That's my worldview, understanding that we're not blameless. Putin is to blame for making that decision. Tulsi Gabbard has a 10-year history, accelerated by 2.5 years ago, of always blaming America and always defending Russia in every single thing she's said. If you're that one-sided in your view, if you're always defending Putin and you're always attacking this country, that's someone I would not trust to be in charge of our nation's intelligence.
Okay,
yes.
okay. Let me just pivot slightly. Dave, you posted this. Marco Rubio is a disaster. Might as well give Liz Cheney the State Department. Awful sign. Why are you so anti-Rubio? But I mean, most other people have said, actually, he's one of the sort of grown-up picks in this list.
Yeah, well, most of the people who are saying that are making the ridiculous arguments that we've heard here today. And they're also the people who essentially, the real issue here, right, is that essentially you have this divide between people who support the foreign policy consensus of the last 20 years. And so it's very easy. See, the thing is here, Joe, it makes the point, right? Like, oh, she's always blaming America. This is what the George W. Bush Republicans post 9/11, this was their brain dead reply to every single left-winger who would criticize their foreign policy. Oh, you're the blame America first crowd or something like that. Yes. Vladimir Putin did invade Ukraine, and that was wrong. He should not have invaded Ukraine. The United States of America is not clean in this invasion game either. And over the last 20 plus years, we have had wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen. Every last one of them was sold on lies, has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, has cost trillions of dollars, and has left the area worse than it was before we invaded or before we had, backed the invaders.
Dave, I agree with a lot of that. Dave, I agree with a lot of that. But I know, Dave, anyway, I agree with a lot of that. But Tulsi Gabbard
but let me finish the point. We'll see if you agree.
We're every bit as bad as Russia. Do you believe we're every bit as bad as Putin? Every bit? That's what she said.
Well, listen, Joe. Okay, that's fine. What instead of just like it's this emotional game? Who do you think's worse? You tell me the metric. You tell me the metric. Innocent people killed. Countries invaded. What's the metric? And then I'll tell you who's worse on that.
Defender of peace around the world, a history of defending peace and freedom. Yes, imperfect.
Wait, hold on. Listen, Piers.
Yes, have made a lot of mistakes.
Yes,
we never should have invaded Iraq.
Now filibuster because you don't want to answer the adversary. Now, Piers, our previous debate aside, I'll give you World War II.
Well, I would say murdering and jailing your political opponents. I would say rigging an election so you get nearly 90% of the vote because you punish people who don't vote for you, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why Vladimir Putin runs Russia like a mafia boss, which is not how America's won. Now, you might argue, and I think you have a point, because I oppose, as you know.
Is it not, Piers?
I oppose the Iran war very vociferously. But do you think America runs around poisoning opponents in streets in Europe, for example? Do you think it rigs an election so that 90% of the people feel obliged to vote for someone, etc.?
Well, so here's the thing, Piers, right? A lot of times there's, in more primitive countries, there's a more naked form of corruption that is more brutal in a way and is more obvious. So yes, it's true that America doesn't resort to kind of some of these tactics. What America will do, right? Like if we don't like the fact that, say, Yanukovych, the democratically elected president of Ukraine, decided he didn't want to join the European Union, instead wanted to do a partnership with Putin. No, we won't poison him, but we'll just foment color-coded revolution, overthrow that government, and install Victoria Nuland's new hand-picked, members. Now, other countries who don't have the power to do that result to these other, tactics. I'm not supporting any of it. I think all of it's wrong. But let's be honest here. I mean, America has been the most war-hungry country in the world over the last 25 years, and why can't we admit that?
Dave, can I just ask one real quick question? All the mistakes we've made aside, is America a force for good around the world, yes or no? A force for good?
I think this is a childish, simplistic question. We are a force for good and a force for bad. And these wars. Yeah. Listen, Joe. The thing about it is the problem is that. Hold on. Okay, Joe, you asked. I'm answering your question. See, the problem is
we're not ending wars in Armenia or South Sudan.
Yes, listen. This is the
Dave,
point here is that No, I'm sorry. Look, the point here is that the issue is that I don't think you actually know anything about what you're talking about. And so when you say that the war in Iraq was a mistake, like it was a whoopsie, no, it wasn't. Go read the Project for a New American Century. They were planning, the neoconservatives who took control of the George W. Bush administration were planning this war for years before 9/11. The weapons of mass destruction and the Saddam. Right, so let me finish the point instead of cutting me off by saying you agree with me. Because yes, I know you agree because I'm making an undeniably great point. The weapons of mass destruction, the Saddam.
I just said, hey, well, you know what, Dave? You're so smart.
I'm not even that smart. I'm not that smart. I'm just arguing with brain-dead morons.
You couldn't answer a simple question. Is America historically, have we been generally a force for good around the world? Yes or no?
Again, I'll answer the question again. It's a dumb, stupid, second grader question. We've been both a force for good and a force for bad.
Okay, look, very quickly.
How we've been a force for good in the world.
Very quickly, to wrap this part of it.
Warfare machine.
All right, but Dave, to wrap this part of it, you haven't actually talked about Marco Rubio. What is your objection to him being Secretary of State?
Piers, this is the fun thing about doing your show. The second you said that, I completely forgot the question was about Marco Rubio. I didn't even remember we were talking about. So essentially,
and it doesn't matter.
The point. So Marco Rubio, is he? Oh, yeah. Okay, so the point that I was making initially is that Marco Rubio is, to his core, somebody who supports the neoliberal, neoconservative foreign policy of the last 25 years. He's somebody who's every one of those disastrous wars that I just mentioned, he was there cheerleading for them and demonizing everybody who opposed them. He's also a hawk on Palestine. He's a hawk on South America. And I just think that in general, particularly with our country being $35+ trillion in debt, having all of these disastrous wars over the last few decades, and Donald Trump at least somewhat symbolizing a break from that tradition and an America first, more non-interventionist kind of policy, I'm very disappointed to see him lead the State Department.
Before we let you go, I want to pivot completely because in the weekend that Mike Tyson made his comeback, obviously losing to Jake Paul in that kind of exhibition fight, Sylvester Stallone, Rocky Balboa, welcomed Donald Trump on stage by comparing him to this guy. Let's watch.
So the image pans down from Jesus onto Rocky being hit. And at that moment, he was a chosen person. And that's how I began the journey. Something was going to happen. This man was going to go through a metamorphosis and change lives, just like President Trump. And I'll just say this, and I mean it. When George Washington defended his country, he had no idea that he was going to change the world. Because without him, you can imagine what the world would look like. Guess what? We got the second George Washington. Congratulations!
He went on to say that Trump was the greatest president since George Washington. Slight hyperbole there or justified, Vinny?
I mean, let's be honest. I know, was that George? I mean, George Washington, obviously, we still have another 4 years to find out if he is going to be the greatest. But, I mean, Piers, just listen to what Sylvester Stallone said. God, intervention, this, religion, all that type of stuff. If you mean to tell me from 2016, everything that they've done to this guy and all the accomplishments that he's made up to this point, plus one assassination attempt that almost took his head off and the other one that they stopped, this guy, if you're going to look at the numbers without COVID, Piers, he's going to go down as one of the greatest ever, period.
Jillian, finally, before I let you go, Jillian, your view, Trump, the new Washington?
Listen, no. I'm going to say no. But the next 4 years remains to be seen, like how we will rank him against all the presidents throughout history. But I wouldn't put anybody up against Washington or Lincoln or FDR at this point. And the one thing I do want to say, just before we go, is that I think to say, is America a force for good, is conflating two different things. What America stands for, yes, that is inherently good. American people, yes, we are inherently good. But I think when you see the military-industrial complex, the guys like Larry Fink, for example, or Dick Cheney, for example, with Halliburton, who are manipulating and corrupting the system through super PACs and campaign contributions. They are pushing these wars because they are exceedingly profitable to them, to the tune of trillions of dollars.
Yeah.
Who has the contract to go in and build Ukraine? JP Morgan and BlackRock. And that's just the start of it. So with that said, I think the military-industrial complex here, evil. I think their intentions, evil. I think what America stands for, obviously, wonderful. And what the American people stand for, wonderful. But I think there were many off-ramps, as Dave said and Vinny said, and we didn't take them, and I think we didn't take them for a reason. And when you talk about mutually assured destruction, I wanted to point out how do you win then? So what are you going to do? You're going to corner this guy? Well, now you've given him nothing left to lose. Hence, you've assured our destruction. That makes me nervous. And the last thing I want to say about this is you're like, well, now look, now there's North Korean troops in Ukraine. Exactly, which is why we should have friggin' ended this years ago. All right, I'm done.
Or we should have been a lot tougher on Putin ages ago, and then he wouldn't have had the balls to do it. Anyway, Jillian, Vinny, thank you both very much. Going to let you both go. We're going to keep Joe and David a little longer because we're being joined now by a debate about Israel. Another Hezbollah chief was killed in Israeli strikes on Beirut this weekend. At least 54 people were killed when a blast was at a residential block in northern Gaza. Trump campaigned on ending the wars both in the Ukraine and the Middle East, but his top team will be packed with pro-Israel hawks. One leader of the abandoned Harris movement of Muslim voters called it a Zionist overdrive. Many advocates for the Palestinian cause said a two-state solution is now absolutely dead. But joining the panel is the Palestinian-American commentator Omar Baddar. Omar, great to have you back on Uncensored. How concerned are you about the fact that Trump has basically packed with his picks here a bunch of extremely pro-Israeli people?
No, it's obviously extremely dangerous, but also extremely predictable. I don't think anybody expected anything better from Donald Trump. You know, just moving away from Biden already was starting at an extremely low point in American policy on Palestine and Israel. Watching this mass slaughter of civilians throughout the Gaza Strip unfolding month after month throughout over an entire year, and Biden's answer to it is to simply supply unlimited military funding and diplomatic support. Yet Trump managed to find a way to make it worse, as he has done before, and he's promised to do it again. And here we are, with him staffing his entire administration with religious lunatics who are deeply, fundamentally attached to the idea that Israel should control the entire land from the river to the sea, that Palestinians should not essentially have any rights anywhere, and that Israel gets to do whatever it wants with absolutely no limits. It's difficult to take Biden's extreme policy to an even more extreme, in a more extreme direction, but that's precisely where we are with Donald Trump.
Joe Walsh, are you concerned about this? I mean, I certainly, if I was a Palestinian right now, my heart would have sunk by some of these appointments and the collective influence of these appointments. You're just thinking, well, we're done for. There's no one fighting our corner with America.
And Piers, everybody knows how I feel about Trump, and I respectfully disagree with our new guest, because when it comes to Israel, I'm extremely pro-Israel, and I agree with what Donald Trump's doing. American presidents traditionally, Republican and Democrat, have been, when it comes to the Middle East, we've been like a referee in between two warring sides. These are not two equal sides. Israel is a force for good, and the Palestinian people, through their governments, have been trying to exterminate the state of Israel since 1948. So I think it's a good, healthy development that Donald Trump has put together a team that's going to tell the world we're no longer a referee between these two. We're on Israel's side. So Palestinians, the rest of you, you want to acknowledge Israel has a right to exist, you better do it now.
Dave Smith,
with all due respect,
Omar, you want to
if I can just come in here, just because, sure, because there's two. I mean, it's incredible that Joe is wrong basically about both points. First of all, the U.S. has never been a fair referee between two equal sides. They have always been just completely committed to the idea that Israel can do whatever it wants. Again, more than 50 vetoes. More than 50 vetoes. Joe, it's been more than 50 vetoes of the UN Security Council to shield any accountability for Israel, and billions upon billions of dollars in military funding no matter what Israel does. And the other point is, it's correct that we don't have two equal sides, and the difference is Israel is the occupier. It is the most powerful country in the region, armed with nuclear weapons, essentially existing on top of a defenseless people, occupying their land illegally, stealing their land illegally, demolishing their homes, killing and torturing them at will. And that's a dynamic that is utterly insane, that you allow a more powerful country to simply stomp on the Palestinian population, deny them all their rights in absolute opposition to the most basic principles of freedom, democracy, equal rights. Those don't exist for Palestinians. And yet the United States' role has always been to essentially provide cover for Israel with this nice rhetoric about we're looking for peace and a two-state solution, all that nonsense. And all Trump has done differently is obliterate that pretense and essentially letting American rhetoric live up to its actual policy, which is that Israel gets to obliterate Palestinians with absolutely any opposition. And it's part of Donald Trump's personality that he likes to bully weak people. In the same way he goes after undocumented immigrants, it's the same with foreign policy. Anybody who has no power should watch out for Donald Trump coming for them. And in this case, it's Palestinians who have the least power, who have absolutely no rights. And we are witnessing the full weight of religious fanaticism combining with U.S. military power right now to allow Israel to obliterate Palestinians. And it's going to be a real question of what happens next.
Dave Smith, the appointments so far that Trump's put forward, Mike Huckabee, who's an unapologetic Zionist, he said, appointed Israel ambassador from America. Elise Stefanik, she's in the top UN job. She's described herself as a pro-Israeli zealot, or being described as a pro-Israeli zealot. Marco Rubio, your friend, the warmongering neocon, as some people see him, is Secretary of State, staunch supporter of Israel. And all this comes at a time when a report on Thursday by the Human Rights Watch says Israel's committed war crimes and crimes against humanity by deliberately causing the mass displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. 1.9 million people, 90% of the entire population of Gaza, have fled their homes in the past year. 79% of the territory is under Israeli-issued evacuation orders, according to the UN. And that, the Human Rights Watch says, is a war crime. That systematic displacement of people is a war crime. And others go further and say this is the very form of genocide they were talking about. What do you make of all this?
Well, I mean, it's, you know, as I've said on the show before, it's a tragedy, and it's the worst thing in the world that's happening over there right now. And just the sheer number of children who are dying in all of this. And you know, by the way, I'm sorry, Omar's right about everything he said. And I just should point out just a correction to Joe, because he got the propaganda point a little bit wrong. Just so you know, I could take over arguing the Zionist propaganda because I know it quite well. But so no, you can't say the Palestinians haven't accepted Israel's right to exist, that you have to move the goalposts now and say because all of them have accepted Israel's right to exist under 67 borders, including Hamas. But no, it's they have to accept them as a Jewish state now. That's the new talking point. But look, Piers, here's the deal, right? And I think that I've seen you host a lot of debates on this, and I kind of have a sense of where you are, kind of, I think, moderate on this topic, and you see some of the points on both sides being made.
Yeah.
Take Mike Huckabee, for example, and by the way, you didn't mention Hegseth, but he's guilty of the same thing too. The religious fanaticism, the way they speak about this conflict. If anyone in a first world civilized society spoke about any other policy this way, we would all rightfully be appalled. I mean, Huckabee, and I understand it's not the most consequential position, but the fact that the symbol of making this guy the ambassador, that he says essentially there's no such thing as a Palestinian, there's no such thing as a settlement, there's no such thing as an occupation, because God gave all this land to Israel, and so these people there just have no rights, and that's that. Now, if anybody in a sane, civilized world spoke this way about any group of people, we would immediately recognize you as a dangerous loon who should be nowhere near power. We simply do not make political calculations this way in any other area of life. I mean, even the pro-life movement has to make an actual argument over why abortion is murder or why abortion is wrong. They don't just get to say, God says so, it's in my holy book. And so, look, to Omar's point, I mean, the Donald Trump, wherever his rhetoric is, typically just carries out the same foreign policy as the American establishment. Israel really is the unique difference, where he's shown in his first term that he's actually willing to go further. And I am very concerned over the signal, like what Benjamin Netanyahu is going to take this signal to mean. And I hope I'm wrong, but I would not be surprised if Benjamin Netanyahu goes for some major escalation, officially annexing the West Bank or something like that. I mean, it's not as if it hasn't already been annexed.
I mean, I'll come to Joe on that, but you see Smodrich, who's the far-right finance minister, saying on Monday he hoped Israel would extend sovereignty into the occupied West Bank in 2025 and would push the government to engage the incoming Trump administration to gain Washington's support. I mean, I think what's been going on with the aggressive expansion of settlements during the last year, I think that has been an indisputable war crime, frankly. It should never have been allowed to happen. And now you've got one of the Israel government openly saying, yeah, we want it. We want the whole thing. We want the whole West Bank. And that just plays, Joe, into the argument that's come from the other side throughout this, which is this has been the bigger plan all along. That actually the way that Israel has executed its response to October the 7th is just total obliteration, making it impossible for Palestinians to have any kind of viable state in Gaza after all this. Therefore, Israel to take over, as it will on the West Bank. It's hard to argue when you hear Smodrich and these guys talking that way, isn't it?
October 7th, Piers, changed everything, period. Changed Israel for good, period. And this notion of, again, I didn't say Omar always a fair referee, but again, this notion of America trying to referee a disagreement here between two sides, that model hasn't gotten us anywhere. It's been fatally flawed. This is not a battle about land. One side, the Palestinian side, fundamentally, they've been fighting since 48. They do not believe the state of Israel has a right to exist. The two-state solution idea is just impossible as long as one side feels that way. The only way, Omar, and maybe you agree with some of this, the only long-range way to peace is for Israel to partner with moderate Arab and Muslim countries in the nation, and we isolate the Hamases and the Hezbollahs and the Irans of the world. That's what Trump's going to do in this term.
Okay, Omar, your response to that?
No, with all due respect, this is such a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamics going back decades. First of all, this has nothing to do with October 7th. You can see that Netanyahu was quoted in Israeli press talking about how there will never be a Palestinian state many years before October 7th ever happened. This is the standard position of the leading government in Israel. Not just Likud, frankly, it's across the spectrum with kind of like minor details of how they talk about it. But they reject the idea of Palestinian self-determination. They don't see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same rights that Israelis get. And the policy has been to essentially oppress and brutalize Palestinians day in and day out, just treating them in the worst ways imaginable and taking their land from under them and shrinking them into smaller and smaller areas. And then when there is an attack, when you do generate a threat from the people who are being oppressed and wiped out, you use that attack as a pretext in order to obliterate them at an even greater scale. And we're seeing that unfolding in a full genocidal scale in Gaza, and who knows what happens next in the West Bank. This idea that Israel can partner with, moderate forces in the region, quote unquote, these are dictatorial regimes in the region with the so-called Abrahamic Accords, in which you are building relationships with governments that you're not at war with in the first place, and you're ignoring the Palestinians entirely. The easy way to achieve any kind of peace is to start with a fundamental responsibility on Israel to end its occupation, because that occupation is illegal. Whether you have a partner or not, it does not matter. You don't have the right to take over somebody else's land and build your country on top of it. If I had a dispute with Joe and he stole $100 out of my pocket, it doesn't matter whether we're going to be friends after he returns the $100 or not. You owe that $100 back, period. And we're looking at the same thing where Israel's saying the reason we're stealing more land from Palestinians is because we don't think they're going to make peace with us even if we gave it to them. That's just a completely ridiculous argument. There has been a peace offer on the table called the Arab Peace Initiative, in which the entire Arab world, the entire Arab League, is prepared to normalize relations with Israel. It was offered back in 2002 in exchange for Israel withdrawing to the 1967 borders and ending the occupation, not as a favor to Palestinians, but as they are obligated to do under the law. You have to end the occupation of a mere 22% of historic Palestine. That was a massive Palestinian compromise that they're willing to settle for a state on just a fifth of their historic homeland. And it's Israel that said no and insisted on expanding more and more settlements, even at times in which violence was at an all-time low, and there was significant hope on the Palestinian side that we could be moving towards a peaceful agreement. So we're just falling for this ridiculous propaganda point that Israel is interested in peace and just can't find a peace partner, when in reality, Israel is taking advantage of its military strength over Palestinians to try to impose itself on top of them and deny them their rights and looking for the opportunity to wipe them out from existence entirely and to push them outside of the territory that Israel wants to control. That's the fundamental dynamic, and American support for it is the only reason why it's even possible.
Dave, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have disputed a lot of that. But I do think what's happened is internal politics is now at play with Netanyahu. Is that 6 months ago, he was incredibly unpopular in Israel. And it was highly likely that if the war came to an end, he would be voted out of office very quickly and held to account for what happened on October the 7th in terms of allowing this to happen on his watch. And he would then be facing corruption charges and possibly ending up in prison. But then came the Hezbollah attack, where 3,000 members of Hezbollah were attacked with pages in a highly sophisticated operation. And from that moment, him and his party have got steadily and quite rapidly more popular, to the extent where most people now believe that if there was an election tomorrow, Likud, his party, would win with a sizable majority. And he now has a real ally of his, Donald Trump, back in the White House, who's extremely pro-Israel. There's no question of that. So again, all of this aligning at the same time. If I was Palestinian, I'd be extremely concerned about what may now happen. And I think Omar might be right, that there could be a dramatic escalation because it will suit Netanyahu politically. And honestly, he's never wanted a two-state solution, has he? I mean, he just hasn't.
No, I mean, he funded, or indirectly, but facilitated funds and propped up Hamas for many years, specifically with the goal of undermining the ability of a two-state solution. And by the way, if you read through like some of the quotes from Israeli leaders on this, part of the reason why he did that was also to kind of suppress the liberal Israelis who favored a two-state solution. And so if you had Hamas in power in Gaza, then you could look to the liberal Israelis and say, hey, we have no partner for peace, and to your point, it's like, this is kind of the nature of the conflict, right? Is that there's this rally around the flag effect on both sides, right? So after October 7th, then this war becomes more popular with the Israeli people. And then as this war goes on, Hamas becomes more popular with the people in Gaza, because everybody's always looking for somebody to kind of go and defend them and go get the guy back who got you, in the same way that George W. Bush had record high approval ratings right after 9/11. And we didn't really care particularly who we were going to go bomb the crap out of, but we wanted to get someone back because we got hit. When you have essentially the Israel and the Palestinians have been at war since at least 1947. There's really, Israel had several wars with other Arab countries, but they were always pretty short and they wrapped up pretty quickly. But the war against the Palestinian people has never stopped. It's been going on this whole time. And when there's been such a long conflict and there's so many different, there's acts of violence on both sides, it's very easy for people like Joe to say, well, this is because of October 7th. They're reacting to that. And then it's very easy for people more on the Palestinian side to say, well, no, the Palestinians were reacting to what happened before October 7th. I think when you zoom out and you look at this conflict, you just can't escape the obvious reality, which is that you just can't do what Israel's doing. You're not allowed to. You can't occupy a group of people for over 6 decades, since 1967. Piers, we have a lot of problems, like, say, within the United States of America. We have some very high crime areas that are predominantly African-American. And if you were like, hey, that's a real problem, we got to come up with a solution for black crime in the United States of America. And I were to say, like, oh, well, here's a proposal. We could just incarcerate every single black man. Poof, black crime, not a problem anymore. I think immediately you'd go, yeah, but that's just an unacceptable answer. Like, you can't do that. And so does Israel have to deal with a terrorism problem? Yes, they have had to deal with that for a very long time. The Palestinians have as well. But you just can't occupy a people forever. And that's what they've done. And then when there's a blow up, when there's another terrorist event, they go, see, that's proof that we just have to keep occupying these people forever.
It's a really, I think that's a really, let me bring Joe back in. It's a really interesting point, that, because it does become, and this works on both sides. I don't dispute that for a moment. But this is the default position, is that everything becomes framed as a response to what has happened before. Everything, right? But ultimately, you cannot deny that Palestinians have been living on the Gaza Strip in particular with fewer human rights than their neighbors in Israel. And that has never been right. It's never been fair. And it can't be allowed to continue. And that's my position about this, is why should they have less rights? I mean, they should have the same rights as you, as me, as Dave, as Omar, as everybody. Shouldn't they? And if not, why not?
I'll make two brief points, Piers. You talk about Hamas, you talk about Gaza. The Palestinian people had their opportunity. And instead of turning, when Israel left, and instead of turning Gaza into a paradise on the Mediterranean, they turned it into a terrorist compound after Israel left. Dave talks about they've been at war since 1947. Who initiated the war? Who initiated the war? And who initiated the war in 47, then 48, and who has initiated damn near every piece of this war over the last 70-some years? I agree that at this point, Netanyahu reflects a lot of the Israeli people who say, forget the two-state solution. But that's a response to 50 to 60 years of the Palestinian side saying Israel as a state cannot exist. Last thing I'll say, Joe Biden's a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. A Zionist simply means Israel has a right to exist as a state.
All right, Omar, final word to you.
Sure. Look, first of all, the idea that Palestinians were given any opportunity in Gaza is simply a lie. From the second that Israel left Gaza, they put it under siege, and they tightened that siege after Hamas won the elections in Gaza. They were not allowed to have an airport because they voted the wrong way. They're not allowed to have a seaport. They can't trade with the outside world. The economy is in shambles. And if you want to question that moral objectivity on this, just reverse it.
Right?
When Netanyahu, Joe, when Netanyahu wins elections in Israel, do you think Palestinians have the right to put the entire Israeli population under siege and to shut down their airport and their seaports and saying you voted for the wrong way for an extremist who is anti-Palestinian and therefore you can't live?
Omar, what could Hamas have done once they assumed control way back when in Gaza? What should they have done, Omar? Hamas.
What do you mean, what should they have done?
When Israel left, and Hamas,
what should Israel have done?
Gaza,
that is the question.
And Hamas is voted into power back in 2007. What should Hamas have done these last 17 years?
Yes. Israel made an offer when Hamas came into power. Israel said, we're going to besiege you and suffocate you until Hamas meets the following three conditions.
Israel. What should
renounce
Hamas
all violence,
have done?
even though Israel does not renounce any violence. And then they said, and then
what should Hamas
I'm trying to answer your question if you would listen. Israel said, Hamas did not have a chance to do anything. They came into power and Israel immediately put a siege on them and said that we're not going to lift that siege. We were not going to live that. They did not leave. That's a lie. When you leave when you leave the inside of Gaza and then you immediately put it under siege and you block anything from going in and out, that's not leaving a place alone. That is you controlling a people through a different method. Joe, I have to be able to finish the sentence. I'm trying to explain to you a dynamic that you misunderstand.
What is the point?
Israel said Gaza could have turned Gaza into a paradise. They decided not to.
Hamas
they did not have the chance to turn into paradise because Israel put under siege.
Such BS.
Hey, Piers,
it is such BS.
I know.
Hey, Omar, it's everything. David, an invitation. David, you come on my podcast. We'll talk about anything you want to talk about, and no personal insults. Omar, I'd love to have you on my podcast. Let's have a respectful conversation about this. I mean,
much as I'd love to give you, airtime on my show to promote your own podcast bookings, gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there. And thank you all very much for that debate. Much appreciated.